Thank you so much for joining Borderline. I'm thrilled to be talking to you today. I thought we should start by defining some terms for people to understand quite what we're talking about. So, what does it mean to be stateless, and how many people are we talking about?
Yeah. So officially, the term statelessness is defined as, or let's say, stateless people as such are defined as people who are not recognized as a citizen by any nation. And that's how is defined in the UN Convention on Statelessness. And that then kind of by default means that they don't have a nationality or no citizenship and are therefore without state.
So, not recognized
Yes.
by any nation.
Yeah.
And so, how many people are we talking about?
So the data topic in the context of statelessness is tough. So there are different estimates. The highest is the one from the Institute on Statelessness and Inclusion. They estimate that there are up to 15 million people worldwide who are stateless. And there have been estimates by the United Nations also around 10 million people. The issue is that there are governments that report statelessness, and then there are some that don't report the numbers. And then again, also definition, although I now shared the official definition, the way that this definition is interpreted can sometimes vary according to the individual government.
Mm. What do you mean by that? It sounds pretty straightforward, isn't it?
Well, there are some things in this world that might be or could be straightforward, but then again, I think we as human beings, we have a tendency to make things a bit more complicated, maybe with the intention actually of making it easier. So one thing that creates an issue is that there is a difference between being de facto stateless or de jure stateless, which means that there are cases in which your statelessness, in terms of not having a nationality, is not yet legally recognized. So in such cases, you might be without nationality and without any documents that might prove any kind of nationality, but you're also not yet in a position in which the government you're living in has actually recognized that you're without a citizenship. And for this issue, there have been different recommendations made actually to provide a so-called statelessness determination process, which is extremely important. But then again, not too many countries have yet implemented that statelessness determination process. And in some cases, so what happens is that people who are not recognized as stateless yet, so de facto stateless, but not de jure, they sometimes end up in this category of being like having an undetermined nationality or unclear nationality. And sometimes those numbers are not counted the same ways or actually not added to the number of people who are recognized as stateless.
Right. So that's an even worse status, that you're not even like legally recognized as not being legally recognized.
Yeah, it's very much worse actually. Yeah.
So let's talk about you a bit. How and when did you come to understand that this status, stateless, applied to you?
It took a while, I'd say. So today I'm 27, and it's hard actually to like name a clear like point in time. I'd say it was a journey. So the older I got, the more I became aware of the fact that something seems to be off, and it's not just our asylum status or migratory status. So the fact is that I was born in Germany. My parents came from West Africa to Germany, and then I was born in the country in Munich. And I was aware of the fact that something was a bit harder for us, especially in points or times in my life in which I got more in contact with other people, like in school, where I was actually the only kid or one of the, maybe let's say 5 kids in my class that had issues with that. And I noticed that something was off also in terms of us having to go to the asylum offices very often, having to prove certain things. Also, at some point, you learn how to read. And then I guess that's something that a lot of people with migratory contexts are like used to, that they start translating letters for their parents. So at some point, I started to understand that there seems to be an issue with us being in this country and that we're often asked to actually leave the country. At that point, I related that to the fact that we are apparently not German. So I did understand that I am born in Germany, but then again, for some reason, I am not considered to be German. And I did understand that, but I didn't really understand what that concept was about, because nationality is something that is very abstract. It's something we kind of constructed as human beings. So it's nothing that kind of grows with you. And at some point, when I tried to administer my life a bit more than I was forced to in the past, because my parents took care of the majority of my things, I noticed that whenever I wanted to kind of register for things, or whenever I wanted to use certain services, that people would ask for my nationality. And I knew that I didn't have one. As I am a person, for some weird reason, I just also offer, it's, well, I don't know if it's weird, but I try not to lie, and I have like this way, like I
It's
wouldn't,
commendable.
yeah, so I wouldn't just for the purpose of maybe signing up to a certain course, I wouldn't just choose, like in this drop down menu then you don't often see, I wouldn't just choose the German nationality just because I, that's what gives me access to whatever I'm trying to get access to. So I then oftentimes just stopped, actually. And then there was a personal incident that was actually pretty traumatizing. And this incident then led to me actually researching the topic a bit more. So that's what I meant with journey. So I understood that there was something off. Then I kind of understood that I don't have a nationality, but I didn't understand that there are so many people affected. And the more you try to get ahead in life, you understand that this is like a constant barrier that is represented to you almost on a daily basis, actually.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned drop down menus. You wouldn't even think of that.
Yeah.
But right, there's so many drop down menus where you ask to input your nationality
Yes.
in for like the silliest things.
Yes.
There's rarely a stateless option in there, is there?
So I have to say, I once saw a stateless option that was when I tried to travel somewhere, and I don't remember where. So it was not the incident I was referring to, which I can go a bit more into detail in a
Yeah,
second.
we'll talk about in a
Yeah,
minute.
but it was something else, and I don't even remember the airline, but they had the option of stateless in it, and that was surprising to me. And I tried it, selected it, and then when then trying to board the plane, there was this issue because apparently the people working for the airline didn't understand what that option actually meant. So what happened, what ended up happening is that the plane waited for me, like I think 30 or 45 minutes even, while the people were trying to figure out whether or not I was allowed to now enter the plane, which was extremely uncomfortable for me. So I guess the majority of people have made that experience of a plane like departing late. In that case, it was kind of my fault, or I was at least the issue that was trying to be solved. So the thing is, even in situations in which that option is offered, or at least in the past, I guess that's already like, maybe that was like 2 or 3 years ago, it then again presents a new issue instead of actually supporting my situation.
You mentioned you had a traumatizing experience that kind of, brought it home for you, what it meant to be stateless. Can you tell me about that?
Yeah. So about 2.5 years ago, I planned a trip to Morocco. I was going alone, and also very much looking forward to it, because as a person that didn't have a travel document until I turned 18, traveling to me is obviously always a very exciting but also nerve-wracking experience. So I planned the trip, and I was actually planning to stay for 2 weeks on my own, um, learning a bit more about the country and new cultures and so forth, just what you do whenever you want to travel, or what you're looking forward to. And prior to the trip, I also tried to understand a bit more in detail how exactly I would be allowed to enter the country. As a stateless person, you don't really take traveling for granted, and you understand what kind of obstacles might appear along the road. So I tried to understand whether I'm even allowed to enter the country. And what happened is that I couldn't find any information that was referring to stateless people. And as I had been living in Germany forever and was born here, and my document was issued by a German authority, I was pretty sure that, or at least it felt, in that moment, it felt just also rational to compare my situation to, or reasonable to compare my situation to the situation of a person that has a German passport. And I then learned that Germans were allowed to enter the country without any additional documents. So I flew to Marrakesh, and unfortunately, when actually arriving at the airport, I learned about the fact that I was not allowed to enter the country. which meant that I was actually forced to stay at the airport for various hours, up to 20 hours actually, until the next flight back to Germany left. And unfortunately, there was not a flight back to Munich, but to another German city. And in that moment, so I would say those 20 hours, apart from the fact that I actually cried a lot, it was also kind of the first time I really felt this upset about the situation. I have to say that before that, I had the tendency to play it down because just also, I guess that's also something that's my parents just made sure that we have a attitude that is more grateful. So I tend to just focus on the things that I have and the opportunities I have in life instead of focusing on the parts that maybe are not working as well. So that was the first time I really realized how hurtful the situation actually is. And how hard it is also for a person to deal with the situation, because the only reason why I wasn't allowed into the country was because I didn't have a visa. And the only reason I didn't have a visa is because I didn't know that I would have needed one. So if I would have been able to find the information, I would have, of course, applied for a visa, and I wouldn't have decided to go there without having one. So that was very annoying. And actually on the way back, I started researching, like that's when probably the 10th or so research journey on the topic of statelessness started. But this time I just stayed a bit more persistent. And it took a lot of time actually and a lot of effort. So it took me like 1, 2, 3, 4, maybe months to really understand the scale of the topic. And then also to get in contact with people who knew a bit more about it.
And that's where your project State Free was born.
Yeah, so I'd say it in this case also was a journey. So I definitely didn't have the idea of creating anything around the topic. Also, I have to say that my mindset back then was I just want to focus on the good things in life, and I really don't want my life to evolve around a deficit I am experiencing. So my initial intention was actually to find I always call it a source of truth, because what I was missing was the information. And in that situation, I was just convinced that there needs somebody, like that was just what I was thinking. I was thinking, okay, somebody came up with this. Somebody came up with statelessness and all of this. So there needs to be a person or an institution that knows all there is to know about the situation. And in my imagination back then, I was thinking that this person or this organization maybe doesn't know how to actually distribute the information in a way that it is accessible to everyone who needs it. So I was actually trying to find that organization and then help them to maybe digitalize the information and make it more accessible. Unfortunately, I noticed that there is no source of truth. And what I did notice was that there are different organizations, which was good, but then it was confusing because I, as a person who was affected, didn't even know about it. And that's when I kind of noticed this gap of communication and felt that instead of just recreating and replicating content that is already available, it would make way more sense to actually have a space in which all of this is collected in a sense by just gathering all of the people that have the expertise in terms of the experience of it, in terms of experiencing statelessness and being stateless, and also expertise in terms of having dealt with it in the legal or political context.
Because as you mentioned, it's not exactly that someone came up with statelessness. It's like it's an absence of something, right? It's a falling in the gaps.
Yeah.
Can you explain how it can be that you're born in Germany, but you're not German, and you also don't have the nationality of your parents?
Yeah. So maybe not the main reason, because there's so many there's so many reasons for statelessness. So, but one is definitely those conflicting laws and gaps that are then created. So, as a person that is born in a country in which you are not able to attain nationality by simply being born there, so that's often it's called jus soli. So, for example, in the US, you just get the citizenship by being born on the territory. In Germany, there is a very light version of that, and that was introduced in 2000. So I was born in 1994. So that didn't apply for me, but it wouldn't have applied to me anyways, because there are certain requirements actually that my parents didn't met at that time anyways. And so in Germany, you inherit nationality from your parents. And if there's no way for you to attain the nationality of your parents, that was the case in my case, then you just end up with none. And what also happens is that this is kind of then I'd say underscored by different obstacles through bureaucracy. So I guess now there's way more knowledge on all of this. But if we look at the administrative side of things, in my case, for example, what happened is that we were categorized as undetermined. And this is, for example, a status, especially in the context of childhood statelessness, in which I, as a person, kind of suffer under circumstances that I didn't create it because I am like my parents didn't have sufficient documents to prove their identity. And then I was born, and then a person in the registry simply decided that my status is unclear. And this is actually stated that is supposed to be temporary. But in my case, that status was actually my status until I was 25. So that's actually way too long. And currently, this is something that's very often emphasized also in the, I'd say, sector of statelessness, is that it's really important to end childhood statelessness as fast as possible, because at some point, and that's the situation in my case, those children grow up to be adults, and then they're just stateless as adults and are in the situation which they, like it's called in situ statelessness. So I'm a person that is stateless, although I have maybe migratory context in terms of my parents having migrated to Germany, but I myself wasn't even able to move outside of the country until I turned 18.
Right, and you are not an immigrant; you are a child of immigrant.
Yes.
For people who haven't experienced this, it's hard to kind of wrap your mind around. It sounds like it's hard for people who are experiencing it. So you have legal residency and work rights.
Yeah.
In Germany, so it's not a situation of unauthorized migration or anything like that. It's a whole other category, right?
Yeah. So in my case, yes, and I'd say meanwhile I have work permits and legal residency. So my residency was always legal in that sense, but there were different phases, I'd say, and oftentimes those things are very much intertwined. There is often this context, but it doesn't need to be. And it also depends on how the status progresses. So in our case, my parents just were extremely determined on finding a way for us, by us I mean me and my sisters, to be able to stay in this country and receive the education and so forth. So we focused a lot on this part of our situation, which means our migratory or actually residence in Germany and how we would at some point get a permit. That was the main focus. It was never so much on the topic of nationality. And I guess also because the knowledge of my parents, oftentimes people become stateless before even knowing that something like that exists, right? So there are cases in which that is very much intertwined, but in my case, I do have a work allowance. I now also have a travel document. The only things that are still complicated for me are, or that's what's complicated is maybe not the right term, it's just not allowed. I can't vote. That's something that is annoying, especially this year, as we had the federal elections in Germany. And I simply always have issues whenever I want to register such a thing. So whenever I need to verify my identity, that's just poses an issue. Before that, issues were not being able to fly. Then I didn't know how to actually register to the university I wanted to go to and so forth. So yeah, it's complex.
Yeah. And still your family had the educational, financial resources to navigate this, which I imagine isn't the case of every stateless person.
Yeah. So I have to say I'm extremely surprised at how my parents were actually able to do all of this, because we were definitely not rich, and we had a lot of support. So a really great support system of people who were just very keen to make sure that somebody takes care of us, and let it be in terms of legal consultancy or other issues. And it is very expensive. I myself am now trying to find a new lawyer also to get more information on whether or not I would be able to naturalize already, maybe, because that's also an issue that oftentimes lawyers don't have the necessary expertise on the topic. And I have been getting different opinions on my situation right now. So I'm searching for a new one, and already have an appointment scheduled for next week. And just hearing the fee, because so far it were always my parents who paid for this, and I had a job, I have a job, and so now I am able to pay for this. But thinking of other people, it's just very hard to grasp how they would be able to deal with all of this on their own.
You mentioned there are many ways that people can become stateless, and yours is one, which is conflicting legislation at the moment of your birth. What are some of the other ways that people become stateless?
One very unfortunate case is, for example, or reason, let's call it that, is just nationality laws that discriminate against specific factors, which can be gender, ethnicity, and so forth. So there are 25 countries which hinder women from passing nationality on to their children.
Wow.
Then, yeah. And those are things that just, because it's just, the thing is with statelessness, it's also something that is inherited. So in a case in which the mother is not able to pass nationality onto the child, and the child maybe doesn't have contact to the father, or the father doesn't want to recognize the child as his, there are issues in which that person ends up stateless, as a stateless child, that at some point might become a stateless adult. And in those cases,
and have stateless children.
yes.
So yeah.
Oftentimes, depending on the nationality law of the country the person is in, oftentimes that person would then have stateless children also.
So that's one way, discrimination against women, against ethnicities, I guess, as well, that
Yes.
in some countries aren't recognized.
Yes, there are some. So there are laws in which your ability to attain citizenship is tied to the different ethnic group you belong to. And so there's a huge case actually in Myanmar. The Rohingya people, they're a Muslim ethnic group, and they have been denied their right to citizenship since 1982. Just by not listing them as a group on the list that actually lists all of the ethnic groups that would be allowed to attain nationality from Myanmar. And that's a huge case also. Another reason can also be like just historical political context, meaning states or nation states that dissolved to some extent or are not recognized also by other countries. So people from Palestine often face the issue that they end up stateless or being categorized as stateless whenever they are in a new country. And then again, bureaucracy, sometimes there are cases in which they are recognized as stateless person, and then there are cases in which they are not recognized as stateless person. And oftentimes there's a huge level of arbitrariness, which even makes it harder to solve the issue.
Sorry, that just sounds like that sounds like an unbelievable headache. I wonder kind of how it feels on a personal level, beyond the legal complexities, that essentially no one nation, no one country is claiming you as one of her own.
I'd say it depends on the day you ask me. So in general, I have to say that, especially as a younger child, I was not too upset about the fact that I don't have a nationality. Also because I'm just, as a person, I don't really identify with the country as such. I often get asked whether I feel German, and I often respond that I don't, which, okay, to some extent has to do with the fact that I have been rejected on a regular basis by the government. But then again, it also is, it's just that I appreciate the German culture and I appreciate everything that I learn here. I've lived here forever, so why not? But then again, I just don't have this national identity. And this just also, like, as a child, it's also meant to me that it's totally okay for me to not be part of a country. But what is not okay to me is that it then limits my access to basic human rights. Because for me to be able to access those rights or to enjoy those rights, it should be enough for me to be a human, but apparently it's not. So what happens is that, of course, it feels extremely, so it's often there's this mixture of disappointment, I guess, also. And anger, actually, not too much, but then in some like individual instances, for example, the Morocco case was definitely in a situation which I felt a lot of anger because I was confronted with the fact that I'm just simply not provided with the means that will allow me to at least deal with the situation. But I'd say the main sentiment is actually disappointment, because as soon as I realized that there are so many people who are affected, it became very clear to me that this is just a topic that is ignored. Because before that, I felt that we were probably the only ones. I guess I thought that there were maybe like 10 stateless people on this world, because I felt like if there would be more, people would at some point actually solve those issues. Now, understanding there are millions of people who are affected and a lack of political will, maybe in some cases, maybe it's not so much the political will, but also like resources or the necessary knowledge to solve the issue, is disappointing to some extent.
Mm. Do you want to feel associated with a nation? I'm trying to think about, because the nation state is still kind of very much the organizing principle
Yeah,
of, our identities, our political discourse, our, kind of everything. I mean, it's from the 19th century, but we're holding on to it
yes,
at the moment. In fact, we're holding on to it more and more. It seems, there was a period there where we might have been a bit more transnational. That doesn't feel like it's the case now. Um, so is this something that you want to be a part of, or do you want some kind of non-national, transnational identity for yourself to be recognized? If that makes sense.
this is such a hard question because it's so hypothetical. Because
It
currently
is.
I do have a non-national status, which
Mm,
is recognized in a sense, but it doesn't allow me to live life the way I want to live it. I guess actually that I would be completely fine with it, if it wouldn't pose any issues for me. I know that at some point, as soon as it's possible, I will definitely try to get the German citizenship, because I know that it's the most reasonable thing to do, also to protect myself and best case also my sisters. So I know that it's the right thing to do, but in the past I had way more, I'd say, romantic feelings about it, because you always like, there's often this reference to like the pursuit of a nationality, and it was kind of similar to me. I felt that, like, to some extent, at least, I have to admit that I think that a lot of the things I was doing were also to some extent to prove my worthiness and value and validate the fact that I am living in this country. And then at some point would be worthy to actually attain the German nationality. And this is, at least out of my opinion, like out of my perspective right now, such a unhealthy narrative. And this is why I currently don't like, becoming a German national to me would at some point just like, they owe me. That's how I feel right now. Like, why not? Right. So it's not so much anymore that I'm begging for it. And I used to, definitely. I really did. And I think a lot of people are feeling this way. And when talking to other status people, I notice that all of us have internalized this feeling of maybe not being worthy enough to be allowed to stay in the country, to be allowed to live free in the country the same way other people do. But the thing is, we are human beings and every one of us is worthy of this. We have just been unfortunate while others have been fortunate, right? So none of us actually did anything for being born wherever they are born and being born in the situation we are born. So we're just in a very unfortunate situation. And that's why for me, this question is, it's so hard, because I think the most honest way for me to respond to that question is that I just don't know. I just don't know. I don't feel like I'm missing being associated with a country right now. But my perspective might change in a few years, of course.
mm. That's really interesting, and I think that's where your experience does actually sound very similar to other migration
Yeah.
experiences. I talked recently, a couple months ago on the podcast with Dina Nayeri, who's Iranian American, and she
Mm.
wrote this book called The Ungrateful Refugee, and she talks about how gratitude is kind of this show that migrants are asked to put on for the native born. And obviously, race is built into that as well, right?
Yeah.
Where you're the outsider that should be grateful to be let in. I wonder how you think about how those things interplay.
Right now, I'm thinking I definitely need to read that book.
Oh, for sure, for sure. It's very good. I'll send you the episode as well.
Yeah,
She's brilliant.
sounds great. So it's so hard to distinguish at this point for me. I often reflect on whether or not what I'm thinking and feeling is really what I'm thinking and feeling, or is it something that I have like learned to think because I felt like this is the way in which I would be accepted in the environment I'm in. So, for example, this thing like gratitude, I am actually a person that is extremely grateful to a lot of like small things. It doesn't need much actually to make me happy. So I do feel like this is something that's just very much core to my character. But then again, this gratefulness in terms of gratitude in terms of being able to be here in Germany. At this point, I understand that I don't need to be grateful to Germany as a country, but actually to my parents that they were able to bear all of this up until a point in which I am a adult that is able to take care of my own life because the struggle was real and tough. And that's when, like, at some point, my perspective changed because I used to be very grateful to Germany. And I guess that's also what my parents maybe wanted because they never said that, like, they never tapped themselves actually on the back for what they have done. And I just also went into that direction. But at some point, I noticed it's not Germany that allowed me to stay here, but it was my parents that actually fought for me to stay here and be here. And of course, it is a combination of both. And despite being stateless, there are other laws that apparently allows it, like a person to, of like me, to be here at this age and this point in time. But I think it's very important to be critical to some extent, at least, and make sure, because you just at some point you just tie your self-worth and everything you are doing actually for yourself to a system that is way bigger than you, and that kind of strengthens this narrative of powerlessness, which is something that stateless people, if it's something I can generalize in that sense, I guess, so often feel.
Mm. Thank you so much. This feels like a good place to stop and allow listeners to reflect on what can the rest of us do to help, and kind of what are the policy objectives of, I don't even know if we can say the stateless community, because I don't know how organized it is, because it's
Good
so
question.
worldwide and spread out and varied.
Very good question. I'd say we are in the process of establishing a so-called community. So since I started reaching out to different organizations and so forth, I was actually pretty frank also about my confusion in terms of not knowing that there are organizations that are advocating for my rights, although I'm stateless. And there is a very low rate of representation of stateless people in those areas. So this is something that the organizations have become more and more aware of. And
so you mean it's non-stateless people in organizations advocating
yes,
for stateless people, so a bit of a savior situation happening there.
Yeah, extremely. Because like the first time I reached out to one of the organizations, I thought that reaching out to them would mean that I would directly meet a lot of stateless people. But that didn't happen. And that is because they are also still in this process of actually understanding that there is a power imbalance that they are somehow supporting by not having people at the core of their work that are affected by statelessness. But that is definitely changing in a lot of organizations. And that's why I'm saying that I think we're in the process of establishing this community. And also with State Free, we are trying to actually build a space that allows for this organization and community building, because it's a digital space that should be hopefully very barrier-free to people, global, so that everyone can access it and actually get in contact with other stateless people. And so what would be like, what do we want? What kind of policy remarks? It depends. Unfortunately, it's so hard because it really depends on the country you live in. There are a few themes and patterns that just appear everywhere. And that's, for one, like the lacking inclusion in terms of whenever there are certain things defined, there are governments that think about how migrants might be affected by it, but there are not so many governments that think about how stateless people might be affected by that. Also, strengthening the expertise on the difference between migration and statelessness and understanding the needs of stateless persons in specific. Then freedom of movement is something that affects almost everyone. Being allowed to travel, regardless of whether or not you have a nationality. That's something that should be allowed. And then also what I mentioned before that, and it's very technical, but it unfortunately extremely important, statelessness determination process, because how would you solve a problem without even identifying it? And if we still are stuck at this point of understanding that statelessness exists, there are governments that actually just say that there is no statelessness in their country, although people know that there are stateless people in their country. So before we, like, if we don't even recognize the fact that we are in this reality, there's no way for us to solve it. So it would be some of the main points. And I guess as an individual who's not affected by statelessness, really helping to share stories and make people in your surrounding aware of it is a very important factor, because one thing that is really, really hindering the process is just the fact that people don't know about it. Stateless people are not able to vote, so they have no influence on the system that impacts them. If people who are able to vote at least know that there is this issue, they can support by just maybe voting parties that support a policy that improves the situation and so forth. So just being aware and actually sharing the stories, making people in your surrounding aware, that's something that's very helpful.
Are there any ways that listeners can help, can support State Free? What stage are you at in the development there?
Yeah, so development is a very good point. We are exactly at the development stage. So we're in the testing phase currently and hope to be able to launch this fall, or it's almost winter already, so winter. But before the end of the year, in case you know any person that either works in the area or maybe is affected themselves, a person that maybe also works on human rights issues, it would be very helpful to just share our website with them. And we are very much trying to also get in contact with different organizations. That's what we've been doing so far, just building partnerships and collaborations, because statelessness is a human rights issue, and also other people in that sector, even if they focus on other things, need to be aware of the fact that statelessness exists. And if you are maybe a person that even is at the intersection of the topic in terms of a lawyer or so, educate yourself on the topic also to be able to support people in that situation.
What's the website?
Statefree.world.
Statefree.world. That's an excellent extension. We'll make sure to have all that information in the show notes and on the website. Thank you so much, Christiana, for all this information and for sharing your story. And yeah, fingers crossed things get a bit easier for you, and much success to State Free.
Thanks a lot for having me. I really enjoyed the conversation.
Thank you.